Part 1. Chapter 1. I snatched a scrambling rat before it could retreat to its hiding hole, breaking its neck in one smooth motion. Samara, a princess is not meant to hunt vermin. That's what my mother would have said if she saw my dirty fingers grab the rat's matted fur, likely as her delicate fingers pinched her nose. I'd have meekly apologized for my unladylike behavior. The dying squeak chased away the echoes of her imagined reprimand like smoke. It had been more than a decade since I'd last heard her voice, pained and pleading. Now I went days, a week at a time, without uttering more than the occasional grunt. It was better that way. Safer. It was all too easy to remember I wasn't a lady, and despite my mother's wild wishes, I'd never been a princess. The prison allowed no delusions. I slid the carcass into the makeshift pouch in my skirts with the others and hustled down the hall to check my traps, adding several more unlucky rats to my collection. My cloth-wrapped feet scraped over the rough stone as I worked systematically through the halls. Time. Somehow it passed too quickly in a day, and too slowly in a year. A dozen rats weren't easy to catch, even with the traps I'd made. Especially not today. A new prisoner had come in. That wasn't so unusual, but whoever this prisoner was, he'd set off the rest of the inmates. The halls had echoed with screams for hours, the rough crack of the whip their metronome. The guards liked to have fun with the new ones. When the other prisoners cried out, they'd have the whip turned on them as well. Catching rats was tricky at the best of times, but the yelling and carrying on had made my job all the harder. They hid in small corners and scratched and bit to try to escape the inevitable, even after they were caught. Not that it ever worked, something I knew all too well. My mother would have thought it was horrific. Me? I was numb to the task after all these years. The disgust of being around dead vermin wears off pretty quickly once you realize it's keeping you away from the living ones. As I walked into the kitchen, Nelson was at his preferred post, the single half-functional chair in the main servant's chamber. It might as well have been a throne by the way he ordered everyone about. "Hurry up, you lazy shit," he snapped with his scratchy voice. "Kitchen won't wait all day." I picked up the pace, taking care not to drop my haul. Nelson leered at me as I passed. I made a show of speeding up, hoping that would soothe his ego. He wasn't as highly ranked as a guard, but rather was a disgraced noble's son, which made him our superior. He lorded his status over us. He was constantly imagining infractions against him. That was how you got sent to clean the toilets. It wouldn't have been quite so terrible if everyone took their turn. Instead, Nelson let his favored few skip their shifts, worsening the smell until some unlucky sap was sent to clean up. Unlike the rest of the Witch Kingdom, magic was inaccessible in Greyir, meaning the feces had to be scraped by hand instead of washed away with an enchanted card. I eased through the doorway, trying to avoid the other servants. The kitchen was half the size it needed to be for the number of prisoners we had. It was the only warm room in the prison, except you couldn't enjoy it. The air was always sticky with sweat from the workers. I deposited the rats near Cook, who was brewing the main course. He accepted them with a grunt, and I didn't bother to acknowledge him before starting on my next task. There was always more to do, and if you looked like you didn't have enough for even a moment, toilets. I delivered the rats just in time to be added to this supper stew. Next on my rotation was washing the dishes from breakfast. Technically, Robbie was supposed to do that in the morning, but as Nelson's lone friend and co-bully, he got away with slacking off more than anyone else. Usually, he put the blame on me when the dishes weren't done by the evening. Washing dishes had some advantages. It was the one place in the prison where we could actually use soap, even if it was the lousiest sliver of soap going. Baths were a thing of the past in Greyir. I got used to the smell after a while, sure, But inevitably, my fingers were plastered with blood after breaking the necks of the rats all day. The blood was the worst part. It never really left, not completely, no matter how much I scrubbed. The downside of washing dishes was that it left you exposed in the kitchen. Out of sight, out of Nelson's mind meant you were safe. The kitchen, which Nelson peered in on with all the impudence of a cat surveying paralyzed mice, left you directly in his line of sight. It took ages to clean the dishes, long enough that Cook finished making his rat soup and supper had been dispersed to the prisoners. He poured 1 cup, a generous one with big chunks of meat, and left it at my side without a word. I nodded my thanks, my stomach rumbling at the sight. The nobles at the Capitol would have been repulsed. But when it's prison slop or starvation, you stop being picky in a hurry. I got only 1 meal a day, if that, and it was mostly due to Cook's charity. I placed the last dish in the drying rack and reached for the cup. It was barely warm and would be cold by the time I scurried off somewhere safe to eat it, any heat sucked out by the prison's chill. But I'd be safe, and safety trumped comfort. I reached for it and readied to make my exit when Nelson's nasally voice cut through. "You've been slacking off," Nelson snapped, appearing so suddenly I just knew he'd been waiting for me to finish. The kitchen was empty now. I just kept my eyes down. Cleaning the privy at this hour meant I wouldn't sleep until nearly dawn. He lifted a bowl with an appraising eye, then another. "These are all still dirty." They weren't, but I ground my teeth and didn't say a single word as he dumped a pile of bowls back into the sink. "Do it again." I said nothing, praying to any number of unspecified gods that Nelson would move along once I washed them again. Unfortunately, he wasn't satisfied. He looked at the cup Cook had left me. It was small, a quarter of a normal portion the others got, even less compared to what Nelson claimed. I braced for him to dump it out and toss the dirty dish into my pile. My stomach clenched at the thought, even though I was no stranger to hunger. Not anymore. Instead, he looked from the cup to me and back, and spat in it. He didn't say another word, walking away with a spring in his step. Whatever. I'd eaten worse. 3 years. Just 3 more years and I'd be free of this place. Once my sentence was finished, I would go to the monastery. They would take me, despite my criminal sentence. I'd finally have a place where I belonged, where I was safe. I just had to make it until then. I continued on the dishes, my fingers pruned from the water. By the time I set the last one to dry, it was well past midnight. I stumbled out of the kitchen, the cup of soup clutched between my hands. I just wanted to rest. Just a few hours. But Nelson was still at his perch, a smirk on his lips. He slid a glass jar over to me. A healing balm, weak and non-magical. This day just got better and better. "You're to see the new prisoner. Cell 48, Block D." The one that had set off the other prisoners screaming. The balm wasn't a gift, not really. Sure, limbs rotting off from infection might sound unpleasant, but in Greyir, the only escape was death. The balm would take the latest captive that much farther from its clutches, though from the hours of whip cracks I'd heard, it might not be enough. I was so tired I dared to ask, "Can this wait until tomorrow?" Nelson shook his head, not dropping that infuriating smile. The fact he didn't slap me for insubordination was even more worrisome. "This fellow could use a woman's touch after the day he had. The guards were quite diligent with him. I heard they didn't leave the cell until after nightfall. Besides, I hear the new guy's a night owl." His little joke barely registered. All that whipping had been on one prisoner? I snatched the balm from the desk and left before Nelson could come up with some other task. Block D was on the opposite side of Greyir from the kitchens, where the most dangerous prisoners were kept. Not that it mattered. Even the strongest witches on the outside were powerless in Greyir. Cut off from magic, they invariably went mad. I stuck to the shadows, clutching Nelson's skeleton key in my hand. Theoretically, it should have been safe to wander about the prison, since all the inmates were locked up, with no chance of escaping. Only a fool would think the worst part of the prison was the prisoners, though. 3 more years. My footsteps were nearly silent as I approached the cell. The screams had quieted at least, the inmates asleep. I didn't relish waking this one up, but he'd be too weak to attack me if what Nelson said was true about what the guards had done. I slid the key into the lock and opened the door, the metal letting out a loud, angry creak. A glint of red flared against the darkness. A rat, was my stupid thought. But those eyes were far too big for rats. I dropped the key with a clang. Nelson had sent me to tend to a vampire. Chapter 2. I wanted to run, screaming, from the cell. If I disobeyed Nelson's order, he'd punish me. He might do something worse than simply sending me to the toilets. But to have to touch a vampire. Which was worse? His copper manacles glinted in the torchlight. Copper, instead of the normal thick iron shackles used on witches. He was bound, arms tied together in front of him, his legs tethered to a stake in the ground where he stood. My stomach revolted. I swallowed down the bile and set my cup down, grateful I hadn't downed it on the way over. "Is that supper I smell?" His voice was unexpected. Stronger than it should have been after the beating he'd taken. Not an animalistic growl, but a silk-smooth voice that curled around me. "It's not for you. You don't eat food anyway." My voice was shaky. "Oh, I can eat." It was almost a purr. "I just have other appetites." His words made me flinch before I was able to hide it, and I didn't miss his eyes narrow on the movement. He was a predator. Any fear would be taken as a sign of weakness. I squared my shoulders. Acting meek around Nelson might have helped me survive, but the bloodsucker would just see me as an easy meal. "I've come to tend you," I said, making up my mind. He was bound. I could deal with this. "But I'll go if you give me a hard time." It was an empty threat. I had no power here, but it'd be easier if he thought I did. "Then, by all means." I stepped further into the cell, the door creaking behind me. The space was dark, only the dim torchlight from the halls offering any guidance. The cells weren't large to begin with, but the presence of the vampire seemed to swallow more space than his build should have justified. I clutched the jar of ointment like a talisman for protection, sticking close to the edge of the walls until I was behind him. A sharp inhale through my nose was the only surprise I let myself show. Cruelty and violence had been constant companions in my time at Greyir. But this... His back was flayed. I'd seen animal carcasses less mangled. I dipped 2 fingers into the salve, debating where to start. His right shoulder still had the most skin attached, so that was where I pressed. Part of me wanted to abandon the salve, to dig my nails in and finish the job the guards had started. Rip him apart. Take revenge. The exposed flesh oozed blood, a dark red canvas. If he was a monster, what did that make the guards who'd done this? I swallowed the thought. Of course he deserved it. Worse. Who cared if he looked no different from this angle, with his red eyes turned away from me, than any other male? He was an evil creature. I'd seen exactly the kind of cruelty vampires were capable of. But I kept my press gentle. It must have been unfathomably painful. How was he even standing? The only hint of his discomfort was a single hiss, cut off with half a breath. Then nothing. Did vampires even breathe? His chest moved under my touch, but they were the undead. It's not like they needed air. No, just blood and blood and blood. Do you intend to continue, or just tempt me with the sound of your pulse all night? His words were unhurried and teasing, like a cat batting a mouse around, totally belying the mangled state of his back. They snapped me from my dark thoughts. I resumed my movements, collecting more salve and covering his back in large swaths. I wanted to be done with this. You don't want my blood. A soft snort. I don't see why you'd be the authority on that. You're close, and your pulse is pounding like a filly's out on her first run. You don't, I insisted. He was in chains, but that did nothing to soothe my nerves. The rats eat better than I do. The water I drink is half mud. My blood would taste awful. With the amount of blood I've lost, I suppose I wouldn't be too discerning, he said glibly. Lean a little closer, and we can find out. I pictured it at his words, tipping forward, his fangs sinking into me. Blood and blood and... I wanted to vomit. I slammed the salve's lid shut. I had mostly finished, but even if I'd barely started, I was at my limit. Let Nelson send me to the toilets for a month. It'd be better than spending another second in this cell. I backed away, sticking as close to the wall as possible as I left. Before you go, look at me. His words shouldn't have stopped me, but the vampire's voice was pure command. I obeyed before I even had a chance to think it through. I hadn't let myself look into his eyes since I'd first walked into the cell. Despite the fact his back was ripped open, he stood tall, proud. His chest was bare, and though the front was bruised as well, it did nothing to hide the definition of his muscles. He had a warrior's body. Odd for such a parasitic creature. His face, though, even bloody and bruised, it could only be called beautiful. It wasn't a gentle, regal beauty. It was a ruthless kind that, if anything, was enhanced by the cuts on it. His jawline was sharp, casting a shadow over his neck in the torchlight. His brows were stark white, matching his hair. His red eyes snared me. Let me out of my chains. Unlike his commanding tone, this he spoke in the same soothing tone he'd used before. Did he think I was insane? That's what I got for daring to speak with a vampire. No. His brows rose as if surprised. Unlock my chains. The commanding tone returned, promising violence if I didn't obey. This time, I didn't answer. I quickly gathered my supplies and turned towards the exit. Free me from my chains and I'll let you escape with me, he hissed at my back. I slammed the cell door shut behind me. Chapter 3. I barely slept. By the time I got back to one of my sleeping spots, it wasn't good to stay in the same place too many nights in a row. It was hardly 3 hours until I needed to be awake. As usual, I fell asleep quickly. No matter what kind of day I had, I couldn't afford to skip a chance to sleep. But my dreams were haunted by unnerving red eyes. Greyir was quiet when I finally woke. My morning routine consisted of tucking away the one threadbare blanket I'd managed to keep from the others for the past year. It also meant I was nowhere near the warmth of the kitchen. The cold stone of the prison floor always left me sore, even after all these years. My back ached, my shoulders were tight. Grooming amounted to little more than cracking my neck and running my fingers through my hair to clear out some cobwebs. The hollow hunger was a frequent companion, There was no point trekking over to the kitchen for breakfast. If I tried to get some when it was fresh, I inevitably got elbowed away, delayed from starting my chores, which got me in trouble, and usually didn't even succeed. I was scrawny. I couldn't elbow back. It was better to keep my head down and stay away, so that's what I did. I didn't have time to waste. At least the witch prisoners had the luxury of sleeping in. I wasn't so lucky. Voids convicted of crimes unlucky enough to be sent to Greyir didn't sit in cells. They served. Born without magic, we were the only ones who could physically tolerate working in Greyir. No void volunteered to live without the comforts magic offered. The witches weren't the only prisoners here. I set off to check my rat traps. I'd devised the traps from pieces of half-rotted wood, some spare twine, and metal scraps. They would have worked leagues better if I had any food to bait the rats with. Without, I caught at most 3 on a good day. I'd gone to Nelson when I'd devised the first prototype. I was young then, maybe 9 years old. I'd cast Nelson into the role of a guide, a leader. I'd thought he might be proud of me. Instead, he snatched the prototype from my tiny hands and threw it on the floor, crushing it under his foot. Of course, that just set off the trap, catching his foot. He yowled, and I'd been so surprised I had actually laughed. He beat me after that, and I learned not to ask Nelson, not to ask anyone for anything. Today, the first trap I checked actually had a rat. I made quick work of it, snapping its neck with practiced ease. It should have been a fortuitous start to the day. I couldn't have been more wrong. To start, aside from the first, the rats were harder to find than usual. The screams of the prisoners resumed, amplified when the whipping began. The halls of Greyir must have been engineered to carry sound especially easily, because no matter where I went, I couldn't escape it. It wasn't that the screaming was so unusual. After all these years, I could normally ignore it. But not today. Instead, one question ricocheted back and forth, over and over. Was he screaming? I couldn't picture it. Even when he tried to order me to release him, his voice had barely risen above its low purr. Did he really think I would throw everything away to help him? Perhaps he was simply desperate to escape his fate. They were whipping him. That I didn't doubt. The wounds on his back would be barely sealed with the salve. A single stroke would tear apart any healing that had come from last night. Could you kill a vampire that way? Why even capture a vampire? In all my years at the prison, I'd never seen one. All I had seen was every manner of witch be driven mad. If he doesn't die, will he go mad too? Look who finally decided to show up. I stiffened at Nelson's voice, cursing the vampire for dominating my thoughts so completely I'd failed in my main task. My official job was to find the rats. The real one? To avoid Nelson by any means necessary. I couldn't say what Nelson did during the day, except that it seemed to be the same thing he did during the evenings. Make everyone around him miserable. The air soured from the scent of alcohol on his breath. Nelson had gotten his hands on some spirits. That always made for a worse encounter. He saw the rat in my hands and snatched it from me. I forced my fingers to loosen, letting him take it. He lifted it, testing the weight. Scrawny. He gave me a look. Did he want me to seem impressed at his powers of observation? We were coming out of winter. All of us were starving. You'll need to find more. Fatter ones. There aren't any more. They're all scared of the damn bloodsucker. The words flew from my mouth before I could stop them. For a moment, we just stared at each other. When was the last time I'd talked back to Nelson? Oh, yes. The bloodsucker you spent the evening with. The guards have been busy with him again today. Maybe you should pay another visit to him tonight. He gave me a meaningful look. This time, I said nothing. I forced myself to lower my eyes. I didn't need another sleepless night. Nothing could be worse than another evening in the cell with that awful creature. He tightened his grip around the carcass. "I'll take this for my luncheon. Maybe it'll make you realize you can't slack off under my watch." A whole rat for himself. My entire morning's work. I bit down on my tongue so hard it bled. Nelson turned, and I should have been relieved it wasn't worse. Instead, anger rolled through me. Indignation. Feelings I'd do well to forget. It's not forever. I meant the refrain to comfort myself, but Nelson heard it even over the choir of screams that rolled down the hall. "What was that?" "Nothing." That's what I should have said. But this time, I raised my gaze, forcing myself to really take a look at my bully. I'd spent the night in a cell with a vampire, argued with him, defied him. Somehow Nelson didn't seem quite as scary by comparison. Where the vampire was tall, Nelson's shoulders slouched like he was always falling towards you. His hair was matted, the same dark, dirty brown like all of ours was, because even his elevated position among us didn't allow for bathing. "It's not forever," I repeated. "My sentence. I only have 3 years left. Then I'll be released from this place. You'll still be here, still taking rats. But I'm going to be free." I braced for the slap, for the fury. In that moment, I even convinced myself it would be worth it. But Nelson didn't slap me. His face didn't contort with rage. He laughed. He laughed so hard the rat he'd stolen dropped to the floor. He clutched his stomach, rolling his head back with laughter. "Free?" he said between laughs. "You free? That's the funniest thing I've heard in years." 15 years. That's my sentence. I've served 12 already. My words were clipped, quick arrows trying to cut through his laughter. They bounced off Nelson's chuckles uselessly. If anything, they made him laugh harder and harder until he coughed and his spit flew at me. Choke, I thought. I pictured it, wrapping my hands around his neck the way I did the rats. Pictured myself twisting. "You're too funny. You really think they'll let you walk out of here? Karya's tits, that's a good one. I'll have to tell Robbie. You're so simple, Sam." He loved the sound of his voice dearly. "There's no end." "There is," I protested. 3 more years. Just 3 more, and I could leave these dark, scream-filled halls behind me and join the monastery. He smirked. "Who do you suppose is keeping count? Anyone who knew you has forgotten you exist. No one is coming to get you. Think, Sammy." My normal revulsion to his assigned nickname was drowned out by the roar in my ears as the implication hit me. Forgotten. By everyone. Someone has to sign off on your release, and that someone is me. Your sentence is done when I write to the king and say it's done. My gut twisted. Technically, Nelson wasn't a prisoner like the rest of us. He was a noble, and while in high society he would have been as valuable as a gutter rat, here he had absolute power. He grinned at my obvious distress. "Who knows? In another 10, 20 years, Sammy, we could be friends, and you'll talk me into letting the royals know your sentence is finished. But mark my words, you will never leave without my blessing, and you're nowhere close to earning it." Acid boiled in my stomach, a mix of fury and nausea. "You can't do that," I protested, even though reality was forcing the walls to close in on all sides. Because yes, he could. My future hinged on Nelson's charity. I was doomed. "And who would stop me?" He shrugged as if it was just a fact of life. "Besides, you're better off in here than out there, even if old King Stormblood himself came down to pardon a gutter rat like you. Do you know what kind of life you'd have? No one would hire a filthy thing like you. Even the brothels wouldn't take you, except to have something cheap on the menu. When they used you up, you'd be on the streets. See how much you make begging with your ugly face." Nelson laughed again, then turned, collecting the rat once more. This time, I didn't say anything. His words played on a loop, over and over. 12 years I'd been here. I'd be here 10 more, 20, forever if it was truly up to Nelson, until either he grew so tired of me he killed me, or I killed myself to make it end. I bent into a corner of the hall and heaved, vomiting up what bit of precious food my stomach had held. The smell, foul as it was, actually drew the rats forward. I killed them with only half a mind, still turning over Nelson's speech. Even as I killed their brethren, they came forward. They were starving, and any chance of food at survival, however disgusting, was worth it to them. Did they know they were doomed? One came slower, dragging a trap half caught on its neck, squealing. I snapped its neck, put it out of its misery. I collected the last of them and brought them to cook. Nelson left me alone. Apparently, he'd had his fill of tormenting me today. But there would be tomorrow, and the day after, and the one after that. He's lying. He has to be. I nearly vomited again in the sink, but there was nothing in me but the barest bit of water. The acidic taste clawed my throat while I forced myself to swallow it down. Now was not the time to show weakness. Nelson's taunts played over and over in my head. My life. Forever. If Nelson had his way, I'd never make it to the monastery. I'd never see the sun again. Can't do this. I can't. Death on my terms would be better than a life like this, a life of dark hallways, of killing rats, of Nelson's taunts. I took my time with the dishes, my mind clouded and hot. Even when the kitchen emptied, I kept scrubbing dish after dish, my mind turning over what I'd learned. I'd thought about escaping before. It was impossible, especially for someone like me. But maybe not for everyone. Once everyone else had gone to sleep, I tiptoed behind Nelson's desk and slipped the skeleton key into my pocket. I hid in the shadows and kept my footsteps silent, counting the cells until I hit number 48. The key slid into the oiled lock without a sound. Red eyes flared open, meeting mine. "I'm going to let you out." Chapter 4. The vampire's white brows drew together. "What changed?" "I don't confide in vampires." I drew a breath. "But I'll make you a deal. I'll unlock your shackles. In exchange, you get me out of Greyir unharmed." The truth was, even if the bloodsucker agreed, I had no guarantee he'd follow through. But what choice did I have? Even if he killed me, he'd only be accelerating my fate. "You have my word." It should have been hard to make myself step into the room, to betray my country and every value I held dear, to willingly unleash this beast on Greyir. But like a cornered animal seeing a sliver of a chance at escape, I barreled forward. This late at night, the cell was utterly dark. The faint torches from the hall barely reached the bars. The vampire's red eyes seemed to glow, tracking my steps into the cell. The chains wrapped all around his legs, with locks on both feet and hands. I started with the feet. I didn't want to be kneeling before him when his hands were free, even if we theoretically had a temporary alliance. I slid the skeleton key into the lock of one, then the other. The manacles snapped open, but the vampire didn't make a move to kick them away, even though the skin under them was covered in blisters. I tugged them away as quietly as I could to avoid the telltale sound of metal against stone. Next came the hands. I rose to my feet, adjusting my body so I wasn't directly facing the vampire. I'd been close to him last night, but being in front of someone was a different kind of closeness. Standing slightly to the side, I could see his back. If possible, it looked even worse than yesterday.
"I'm sorry to say they undid your efforts,"
he said, as if reading my thoughts. Heat rushed across the back of my neck. Caught. I shouldn't care. He was just a vampire. But something like shame licked at me all the same. I'm not surprised. They only ever healed to inflict more pain. I slid the copper handcuffs off. I could have discarded them like the others. Instead, I slid them into my skirts, cushioning them as best I could. The vampire slid his hands over his wrists, the only hint of discomfort.
"I suppose if you knew how to escape this prison, you'd have done it yourself,"
the vampire mused. I exhaled through my nose. Of course I know the way out. The trouble is, there's only one way out, and it's manned with half a dozen guards at every hour of the day. Not to mention the patrols that went through the halls. But nothing ever happened at Greyir, so they were light, and I knew their assigned routes. Can you handle them? Stupid. I should have asked before releasing the beast. A sardonic twist of his lips.
6 mortal men. How will I ever survive?
The movement revealed just a hint of canine, unnaturally long and sharp. I stumbled back. Blood, and blood, and... He sighed, and the casual nature of it shook me from my panic.
So skittish. Relax, mortal. 6 or 60 makes no difference.
I swallowed the bile in my throat, and with it any thoughts of guilt. It was too late to turn back now. Follow me. A vampire at my back was unsettling at best, but I didn't trust him to not draw attention stumbling around Greyir. The last thing we needed was someone alerting the prison guards of an escape. The guard routes looped through the cell blocks, so I led us around towards the kitchens. It was a risk, but if we continued straight down, we'd definitely hit the patrol and they'd raise the alarm. After years of practice, my steps were silent. The vampires were effortlessly silent. He was so quiet I kept wanting to look back to confirm he was really there. Once was enough. My silent shadow was staying very, very close. Halfway down, 78 steps from the bottom precisely, I paused. My plan for the vampire had been half thought out at best, but going down this particular staircase offered me another opportunity I hadn't explained to the vampire. I bent down to the loose stone I hadn't removed in years, my last connection to my family hidden away, a necklace I'd been given as a child. I couldn't leave without it. The vampire's gaze burned. My body blocked his view as I slid the contents of the hiding spot down the front of my shirt, tucking them between the band of fabric and my chest. I stopped just before the last step and waited, listening. I could barely hear anything over the roar of my own heart. I drew forward, slowly. No one will be there. I forced myself forward. A glance out said the area was clear. The hallway had no shadows to hide in, no curves to hide behind. But it was late enough. Everyone should be asleep, tucked away in different corners. Once we got past this long hall, we'd be just a few quick turns from the entrance.
"Who's there?"
Someone slurred. Shit. I should have bolted, but a decade of instinct made me stop and turn to the voice. Nelson emerged from the kitchen, a bottle of spirits in his hand.
"You!"
He braced on the doorway, rubbing a hand over his eyes.
"You insane bitch! You set the vampire!"
Crack. 1 second, the vampire had been by my side. Next thing I knew, he was in front of Nelson, twisting his head around. Nelson collapsed with a thud, his neck at an unnatural angle. You killed him."
"How observant."
His words were bored. He'd just snapped Nelson's neck, the man who had made my life hell for a decade, and he was bored. I could do nothing but blink. Monster. He was a monster.
Tell me, mortal, what do you think I'm going to do when we reach the guards?
He'd kill them. I knew it. I told myself I was okay with it. My freedom for their lives. Maybe I'm a monster too. Especially because when I gave Nelson's body one last look, there was no grief, no regret, just dark satisfaction. Those next hallways were a haze. Our steps were silent. No one had heard Nelson's last words. My heartbeat crashed against my eardrums over and over, louder with every thump. We rounded the final corner. One spotted us.
Prisoners escaping!
The other guards turned to us at once and began to move toward us. The vampire stepped in front of me, blocking me from their view.
Stay out of the way,
he growled at me. I had no delusions he was protecting me, only trying to make his battle easier. He'd hear no protests from me. Then they collided. The clang of metal pierced the air. Even unarmed, the vampire made quick work of the king's soldiers. He snapped one's neck, same as Nelson. The next he used as a shield, while a third attacked. He tossed the body at the third, then moved to the fourth.
"He's got a thrall!"
another shouted, leveling his sword at me. I didn't know what a thrall was, but the guard charged at me, sword high. I screamed. The vampire slipped from his fight in an instant. The guard never reached me. The vampire threw the guard against the door so hard the metal dented. The remaining two didn't have a chance. One he killed with the dead guard's sword. The next, the vampire slipped behind and bent the man's neck sideways, killing him instantly. But he didn't drop the body. He bent his mouth over the man's neck and pressed against it. I stood frozen, unable to look away. I unleashed a monster. All the guards dead. Because of me. Because of my choice. He released the guard's pale corpse a moment later, letting it slide to the floor and stepping over it like it was nothing but trash. He wiped his lips with the back of his hand, smearing the remainder of the guard's blood. His ruby eyes glowed even brighter when he leveled his gaze at me. My knees shook. Was I next? We had a deal, I stammered.
Of course.
Despite the violence, the words were the same hypnotic lull he'd used before.
Now to leave.
The massive door stood before us, the floor slick with blood. I made myself ignore it and forced myself to believe that my heel nearly slipped in a puddle of water, nothing more. The vampire went to the door, testing the handles. It was locked, of course. I cursed. I hadn't seen this mechanism before. My skeleton key would be useless. I'd need time to figure out. Boom! The vampire had thrown one of the fallen guards past my head, straight through the door. Chapter 5. The ruined doors collapsed with a thud, and I stumbled out of Greyir. The sound barely registered. I could scarcely breathe, tipping my head back to take in the sky. The 3 moons glowed overhead, almost painfully bright after a decade of waning torchlight. How could the sun be brighter than this? My dreams had lost the vividness, the way you could see the light radiate from each of them. Freya, the dancing moon, was nearly full. Caria, the walking moon, and Laina, the running moon, were scarcely slivers. The taste of the night air was soft on my tongue, like an embrace. It was just newly spring then, but unseasonably warm. Or maybe that was from the sweat that coated my back after our frantic run to escape. Our run. My shoulders stiffened. I'd been so lost in the sight of the 3 moons that I'd noticed little else, but the area around me hadn't. The forest surrounding Greyir was eerily quiet. A great predator lay in their midst, right behind me. I turned back to the vampire. I'd half expected him to take off the moment he was out of the prison. There were no guards outside to stop us. No one ever tried to enter Greyir without invitation. His silver hair glinted in the moonlight. His red eyes were fixed on me, but for the first time, they lacked that raptorial glint. I fought the urge to wipe a sweat-soaked lock of hair from my face. Now that I remembered his presence, I didn't dare take my gaze away from him. How easily they could kill humans. Memories of blood, of flesh rending from bone as easily as one tore off a piece of bread flashed in my mind. I swallowed. The moment stretched on, and I felt the last thing I expected around a bloodsucker. Awkward. I shuffled on my feet, edging back. Well, thanks for helping me get out. You've held up your end of the bargain.
I have.
His voice was different outside the walls of Greyir. Irrationally, it reminded me of the night breeze. Then what are you waiting for? I thought irritably. The western border is closest. I pointed in the direction which naturally was the opposite way I intended to go. True, we were several days' ride from vampire territory, but witches avoided settling near the borders. Greyir was the farthest outpost in the Witch Kingdom, and it was still nearly a respectful distance from vampire territory.
I'm aware.
But still he stood there looking at me. I was loath to turn my back on a vampire, but it seemed he wasn't leaving until I did. He hasn't killed me yet. It wasn't the most reassuring thought, but it was the best I could manage with my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. He'd just drained the guard. He could drain you too, my vicious mind hissed. But surely he wasn't hungry now. I just needed to escape before that fact changed. I'm just going to head out then. To find a monastery outpost that would take me in before word spread, and I was hunted down. One step back, still facing him. Then another. When he didn't move, I began to twist away in earnest, but his voice cut through as sharp as any of the guard's blades.
No, you're not.
Chapter 6. My heartbeat accelerated, pounding so fast I could scarcely breathe. Yes, I am. Mad. I had to be mad to argue with the vampire. Be silent and survive. Words I'd lived by my entire life, even longer than I'd been in Greyir. But this night was so far out of the realm of my reality, I could scarcely believe it wasn't one big hallucination. We had a deal. A deal I must have been a fool for believing would protect me. A desperate fool.
And I upheld my end of the bargain, seeing you safely out of this wretched prison. However, you'll hardly survive on your own.
I stiffened, but the vampire gave no notice.
The guards will be found at the next shift change. This will hardly go unpunished.
You're the one who killed them, I protested.
You're the one who set me free, Dove.
He rolled his eyes and began to tick his observations on his fingers.
They'll have hounds on your scent, and tracking spells, too, once they can convince a witch to come to this cursed place. You'll be executed for treason before the end of the week, and that's all assuming a troll or kobold doesn't get to you first. Your only chance to survive is through me protecting you.
I'd rather a kobold kill me than a vamp. I wanted to hurl the words as I fled, but if I ran, the vampire would catch me. He'd killed 6 guards like it was nothing. If he wanted me dead, I'd already be in bloody pieces. My feet remained rooted in the ground. Why would you want me to stay with you? I'll just slow you down. The vampire canted his head to the side, studying me. Whether he'd expected me to immediately bow to his wishes or to stubbornly refuse, I wasn't sure. Probably the former.
He hadn't expected questions. But he'd said the magic word. Survive. Perhaps I'll want a snack. Absolutely not. I'd rather die than let a vampire feed on me. There was nothing left in my stomach to vomit up, but if there had been, I'd have lost it all then. My fingers shook as I tried to reach for my skirt pocket, clasping for the cursed copper cuff like it might save me against this beast. Or perhaps not. You smell utterly repugnant. I'd likely get a tastier meal from a half-rotted animal carcass, he drawled, wrinkling his nose slightly. I'd never been more grateful for the lack of hygiene at Greyir. Though it's true I'd move faster without you, you can still be useful to me. I need to pay a visit to Aponte. The City of Answers. But you're a vampire. The oracle magic there would never serve him, never give him what he needed. How observant. A flash of teeth, this time almost mischievous. But you are decidedly not. That was true. I could get him the knowledge he craved, whatever it was. This definitely made more sense than him continuing to protect me out of the goodness of his unbeating heart. But it would be another betrayal of my kingdom. What answers do you seek there? Sorry, Dove. I don't confide in smelly mortals. He took a step closer, sensing me wavering. You don't trust me. That's wise. But you're safer with me than without, especially since I could use your assistance. My stomach twisted. Above, the sky had already lightened from utter darkness to a deep mauve. The guard change would happen soon. I didn't want to be anywhere near the prison when the bodies were discovered. If I went with the vampire, I could still find refuge in the monastery. Aponte would have a big outpost, big enough to protect me if any of the king's men came searching. Fine. And with that, I gained a bloodsucker for a traveling companion. Once I agreed, the vampire wasted no time setting off. We traveled 3 days with little rest. He didn't seem to care much for either of our comforts, but I wanted as much distance between us and Greyir as possible, so I didn't protest. We mainly traveled during the night. I was so perpetually exhausted that switching to sleeping during the day wasn't a big adjustment. If anything, it was easier. After so many years of darkness, the sunlight was almost disturbing in its glory. We did walk during the day as well, however. I'd thought vampires were unable to stand sunlight. My vampire apparently just found it irritating and stuck to the shade. In fact, there were a great many things about the vampire that didn't match what I'd thought. He didn't act anything like the uncontrollable fiend that haunted my memories. He moved fast, much faster than me, but whether that was because he was a vampire or simply that his legs were several inches longer than mine was hard to say. His eyes were the telltale red, but after a day or so I found it less terrifying and more just a bit unsettling. He didn't bully or taunt me. In fact, he barely spoke at all, which was an improvement over my experiences with Nelson. We slept on the forest floor. We'd need to find proper shelter eventually, but right now we were in silent agreement to rough it. The vampire slept on his stomach, his bare back exposed and still shredded. Once, as we settled to the ground, I saw him cover a wince, a reminder he was, if not a living creature, then a creature that could feel pain all the same. Truthfully, the forest floor was soft compared to the places I'd slept during the past few years. As bad as traveling with the vampire was, there was one major benefit. Everything knew he was the most dangerous creature around, and steered clear. On the 4th day, I woke to him returning to the clearing we'd settled in from the thick of the forest. Blood colored his lips. My own parted at the sight. Just when I was getting close to, not forgetting exactly or accepting, but at least adjusting to the vampire. Blood and blood. Those blood-red eyes rolled at my palpable horror. Relax. It's not human. Just a stray deer.
You might have brought the deer back with you, I groused. I scavenged what I could of plants when we walked, but I wasn't confident I could tell nightshade berries from blueberries after all these years of rat soup, so my pickings were conservative. I'd never spent much time in the forest, and I didn't have any cards imbued with healing magic. I was used to eating little. It didn't stop my stomach from rumbling at the realization he'd had a deer, fresh meat in his hands, and just left it wherever.
Catch one yourself if you're hungry, was all he said.
But the next day, a rabbit, drained of blood, was by my head when I awoke. I couldn't force the words, "thank you," out of my mouth, not even when he said nothing as I took the time to dress and cook the rabbit, eating my first real warm meal in years. I had no utensils, so I ate with my hands, crouched over the small fire I'd made to cook it on. It was delicious, tender and juicy. I gripped the food closer to my mouth. My mother would have been horrified. My stomach could scarcely believe it was properly eating and threatened to cramp, but I refused to stop. Only when I was nearly done with the rabbit did I catch the vampire watching me. He leaned back against a tree, arms crossed over his bare chest. His white hair fell forward over his eyes, but I felt them acutely.
"You'd be a wonder with fangs,"
he mused. Was he mocking me? From a vampire, that was probably a compliment. The thought of being turned into one of his kind made me lose the last remnants of my appetite. I buried the bones and covered the fire. The forest was colder at night, so it was good to move. We had no spare clothing, no layers. We were lucky we'd avoided any bad weather. The food in my stomach put a spring in my step, even if the sensation of being full was disorienting. I wasn't exactly sure how far away Aponte was. I hadn't seen so much as a map since I was a small child. The only thing I was confident in was that we were going north, since Freya and Laina were at our back. The night we'd escaped had been a fever dream. The next few nights were, too, as if things were half happening to another person while I watched. Now the haze seemed to settle. I had escaped Greyir. I was traveling with a vampire. I had betrayed my country, resisted my sentence, and set free one of our mortal enemies. Even if I helped the vampire and then escaped to the farthest corner of the kingdom, I'd still be a criminal.
Stop thinking so much. It's distracting.
I stumbled behind the vampire. I always walked 2 steps behind him. How could he tell what I was thinking? "Can you read minds?" I asked.
He huffed. "I don't need to read your mind to feel the cogs turning between your ears. Spit it out."
I wasn't about to confide in the vampire. Instead, I asked the other question on my mind. "Why isn't your back healing?" The skin was still ripped several days later. Scabs had started to form. There were blisters along his broad shoulders. Blood was caked around. It looked impossibly painful. And since it didn't feel right to walk side by side with the vampire, that had been my view for the past few days. He turned back, an arched brow raised as if surprised this was my question.
"A few reasons. First, we've been walking during daylight hours to make up for the fact you're so slow. If we limited ourselves to the cover of darkness, the guards would catch up in a heartbeat. If they're foolish enough to pursue us, that is. It would take some horses soon to put proper distance between us and them. Even you must know the sun is no friend to vampires."
So, the sun did do more than just make him irritable. Good to know.
"Then there's the animal blood." He grimaced. "It's not what we're meant to eat. It'll keep me alive, but little more."
Meant to eat. Like it was natural to feed on people. Why didn't he try to bite me, then? There was nothing I could do to stop him. That question, though, I kept to myself. I didn't need to be giving the vampire any ideas. Would the salve help? He paused in his step, just slightly. So slightly that anyone watching less closely would have missed the moment of hesitation. For once, I'd truly surprised him instead of the other way around. The salve. Of course the salve would help. I'm healing like a cursed mortal at the moment. But unless you know how to make more... He stopped and turned to me, his lips thinned in annoyance. You took some with you. He read the answer on my face. By the blood, why didn't you say something? I hadn't said anything because I'd planned to keep it for myself, either to use or barter with when I reached a nearby town. But seeing him suffer like that, knowing it was due to my slow speed that he had to face the sun, made me feel guilty. Does it matter? The point is, I do. You should have told me, he snarled, his fangs catching the glint of the moonlight. I can't protect you if I'm weak. Did he really expect me to believe my safety was his biggest concern? Besides, I'd seen how he dealt with the guards, saw it every night when I closed my eyes. Even weakened, he was a monster. We'll stop here, he announced. It was early, for our standards anyway. Dawn was nearly an hour off. Shouldn't we keep going? You're the one who keeps mentioning how slow we're traveling. They'll have horses. Don't pretend like you aren't exhausted. I'd rather be tired than dead, I snapped. Let's keep going. The vampire sat on a fallen tree trunk, stretching his legs. From this angle, he was below me, tilting his head up to meet my gaze. Yet it still felt like he was looking down on a lowly human. I'm not going any farther until you put that salve on my back. And since you're so twitchy, it'll probably take you until dawn to work up the courage to do so, even though it's in your best interest. Twitchy? Was that what he called having an extremely rational fear of creatures that could tear me limb from limb in a matter of seconds? I took the jar from my pocket and threw it right at his torso. He caught it instantly, not so much as flinching. Do it yourself. Let him tend to his own wounds. Or, he drawled, tossing the jar up and down as he considered me with those awful red eyes. I could drink some of your blood and heal in an instant. Your choice. Since I'd rather turn myself over to the crown than let the vampire feed on me, I chose the other option. I despised the shaking in my arm as I took the ointment back. The vampire turned wordlessly, point made. I settled behind him on the log. It was almost like the night I'd met him, except this time, instead of obeying an order to deal with him while he was bound and powerless, I was choosing to heal him, and he was choosing to just let me. The copper cuffs I'd snagged sat heavy on my thigh. My one possible defense if he attacked me, though I was probably deluding myself in thinking I'd get a chance to use them. Maybe when he slept, if I needed to get away. But again, I was here by choice. I thought I'd fallen far when I was sentenced to serve at Greyir. Now I was teamed up with the mortal enemy of all witch kind. The antiseptic smell of the ointment tickled my nose as I opened the jar and dipped 2 fingers in. Once again, I started from the shoulder. Will we keep walking after I do this? I was still anxious about the thought of the guards catching us. All it would take is one well-aimed arrow, and I'd be dead. I didn't have so much as a fortifying card, let alone any proper defensive ones. You can rest easy. If they find me, I'll take care of them. Then more people would die because of me. Because I'd traded their lives for my freedom. An immoral choice, but it was impossible for me to pick anything other than survival. But they'd be chasing the vampire. They'd probably assume he had killed me by now, right? While there was magic that could find guilty parties in the kingdom, it wouldn't specifically seek me out if the vampire was the prize. If they're hunting you, then I'm not any better off than on my own. They had caught him before, but I didn't point that out, too eager for any justification to split up. We could split up you'll be faster without me."
"So quick to be rid of me, human?"
His voice was low, teasing.
"And how do you suppose you'll fare against the trolls?"
"We haven't seen any trolls," I reminded him. He chuckled, the large muscles in his back rippling with the movement.
"Because you're with me, and even creatures as stupid as trolls know better than to mess with vampires. Besides, you forget we have a deal. You're going to help me in Aponte. Then you'll be free to do as you wish. By blood, you could join that cult of a monastery. Even the king wouldn't come for you then."
Shock rippled through me, and all I could do was stare. Was my plan so obvious? The monastery was one of the few sanctuaries for voids like myself. Those with magic had all the power in the Witch Kingdom, but the monastery would take in voids as disciples to serve in their ranks. It was my only chance to live a life after deserting my post. I frowned. How did the vampire know all this, though? The silence stretched between us as I smoothed the salve over his rough skin. Seventh hell they'd done a number on his back. Yet he just sat there, letting me apply the healing ointment without so much as fidgeting. I slid 2 fingers into the container again and targeted a particularly bad spot on his back. By mistake, I misjudged the depth of a wound and hit what was an especially sensitive part. Other prisoners had hit me sometimes for that kind of thing. Those in pain liked to inflict it on others, even if they were helping them. The vampire didn't move at all. The only hint of pain was a barely audible hiss that could very well have been the leaves rustling. Were vampires naturally so still, or did he force himself to stay in one place because I was so twitchy and he worried I'd run off if he moved too quickly?
"I can't protect you if I'm weak."
Laughable. As if anyone had ever been able to protect me. And yet, if I imagined anyone other than a vampire saying the words, I might have tucked them in my chest and held on to them, precious as gold coins. "Thank you," I eventually said. "For the rabbit." He waved it off.
"Think of it no more."
The rabbit was more than I'd eaten most weeks. I would think of it. As I slept, when the gnawing pain I'd almost grown numb to was gone. When I woke, and my first thought wasn't of food. Finally, his back was covered. The jar was 2/3 empty. Flecks of blood were interspersed in the ointment. Unlikely anyone but the most desperate would trade for it now. Then again, if I joined with the monastery, I might not need to trade. I moved back and stood from the log, adjusting the jar in my skirts as I scanned for which part of the ground I might like to sleep on tonight. I braced to take a step, then paused. "My name is Sam." I wasn't sure why I offered him my name. He'd likely never use it, continuing to call me human or mortal. "Samara."
"Samara," he repeated. "I'm known as Raphael."
Raphael, a monster with a name.
"You're quiet for a human, Samara,"
the vampire murmured after a long moment. Talking seldom got me anything but trouble. "And you're sane for a vampire, Raphael." He chuckled, the sound like storm clouds over the moon.
"Only sometimes."
We settled into our respective spaces, giving each other a wide berth. There wasn't much to our sleeping ritual beyond claiming our spaces and shutting our eyes. Maybe because we'd stopped earlier than usual, though, I lay there awake. The 3 moons would soon be chased away by the sun. And instead of waking with the hunger on my mind, I woke with a name on my lips.